Welcome to People's Republic with Brian Griffith. We bring you news and analysis from the front lines of the global struggle for social and economic justice. I'm your host, Brian Griffith, and here's what's going down this week in your backyard and across the world. Welcome to People's Republic. My name is Brian Griffith. This week, we are following up on a story that we covered briefly on a previous episode. This is regarding the waste control specialist proposed a radioactive dumping ground in West Texas in Andrews County. We covered it briefly from the kind of perspective that was given to us by the local news, the Austin American-Statesman, but I think it's very important that we cover this from, what the actual stakes are from kind of a radioactive watchdog perspective and a nuclear watchdog perspective. So to talk about all this from kind of a perspective of more expertise is Kevin Kamps. He's a radioactive waste watchdog at the organization Beyond Nuclear. Thank you, Kevin, very much for coming on the show today.
Hey, thanks for having me on.
It's a pleasure to have you on. I'm wondering if we can, get into what the real stakes are here, because the article that I was reading from the Austin American-Statesman kind of positioned this as being a low-level radioactive waste site that where the kind of chief way they were setting it up as sort of a battle between nuclear waste, essentially the attempt to put in a nuclear waste dumping ground versus the kind of oil and gas companies, and setting that up as kind of the primary battle without really establishing what's at stake. But the Beyond Nuclear press release about this describes it as a much kind of more serious issue than this local coverage might have led on. So maybe you can tell us what this radioactive waste site is all about, what the dumping ground would be. What does this mean for the people of West Texas and generally the people for the U.S. and the planet?
Sure. Well, unfortunately for Texas and for New Mexico, that's right on the state line, and for the Oglala Aquifer, it's above that. You've got a toxic chemical dump that dates back many years that's been operational there. Then it expanded into a low-level, so-called radioactive waste dump. And I say so-called because some of those low-level radioactive wastes can deliver a fatal dose of gamma radiation, for one thing, if handled at close range with no radiation shielding. So that doesn't seem like too low-level to me. And then, in addition to that, there's been a proposal for 3 years now, maybe longer than that already, to expand the low-level radioactive waste dump into a high-level radioactive waste dump. And what they've applied for to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission is a license to build and operate a high-level radioactive waste dump for 40,000 metric tons of irradiated nuclear fuel from the commercial nuclear power industry. That's about half, a little under half of what exists in the United States right now. So it's quite a mess out there. And as we speak, the Texas legislature is considering legislation that would majorly expand the low-level radioactive waste dumping that's already going on. It's a national dump site. You're getting low-level radioactive waste. Again, that's a euphemism from the entire country at this point.
Wow, that's really kind of incredible that it keeps kind of getting upgraded, and that didn't even kind of make it into the coverage on this, which just describes the waste that was currently being considered as rags, syringes, and protective clothing from the from nuclear plants, and I think they also included hospitals in there. So I wonder what sort of radioactive waste are we really talking about, and how has it managed to be upgraded this much?
Yeah, well, incredibly, the regulations in this country are already so bad, and Trump's trying to get rid of even those. What's considered high-level radioactive waste in this country is just the nuclear fuel that comes out of an atomic reactor. Everything else, all other radioactive waste streams, are considered arbitrarily low-level. And the hottest of those, Class C, is what I was referring to. If you were to be exposed to that at close range without radiation shielding, you could get a fatal dose of gamma radiation in as little as 20 minutes, and they call that low-level radioactive waste. So that's already going to waste control specialists. In fact, WCS, for short, is pretty irresponsible in its behavior. They've taken some very hot radioactive waste, again, considered low-level, but that's a joke, that are being turned down by others. So I would just give a couple examples. One would be potentially exploding barrels of military plutonium waste that, in fact, one of them did explode in the underground at the Waste Isolation Pilot Plant in southeastern New Mexico, close to Texas. And that single barrel bursting in the underground at WIPP cost $2 billion to recover from. And they're still sitting on some of these barrels at the surface at WCS. So can you imagine what would happen if one of these barrels explodes at the surface in West Texas?
Yeah, that's really kind of a horrifying prospect. Absolutely. And, you know, this is when we're talking about 40, let me just pull this up real quick, 40,000 metric tons. The danger here is very much that this is currently being proposed as, you know, from my understanding, as a kind of temporary dump site. But Beyond Nuclear and other organizations have pointed out that this has a very real potential to go from essentially a so-called, you know, temporary dump site to a de facto permanent surface storage, quote unquote parking lot dump. And I think, you know, for that to be happening and for this essentially just so much radioactive waste, 40,000 metric tons to be sitting there on the surface, especially in a time of a major climate change, I don't like that. That very clearly to me is not a stable situation. It's not something that, that anyone I can imagine would want in their backyards. There doesn't seem to be kind of the popular understanding there of what this is and, you know, the how much of a devastating impact this could have.
Well, just recently, Energy Secretary Rick Perry, the former governor of Texas, did us the favor of telling the truth in a congressional hearing. We've been warning about that risk that the so-called consolidated interim storage facility for high-level waste in West Texas could, in fact, become de facto permanent, that it would never leave and it would be at the surface. And just a couple of weeks ago in a congressional hearing on Capitol Hill, Rick Perry very flippantly said, oh, yeah, sure, it could become permanent. The people of Andrews County, West Texas, would welcome that. So give that man a microphone. You know what's really kind of radioactive in a swamp monster kind of sense is where this waste control specialist came from in the first place. It was founded by a Dallas billionaire whose nickname was the King of Superfund sites. His name was Harold Simmons, and he specialized in Superfund dumping in West Texas, and then it quickly expanded to low-level radioactive waste dumping. The reason I mention him is because he was Rick Perry's top campaign contributor in his runs for governor, in his runs for president. In fact, Harold Simmons is the same guy who swift voted John Kerry in the 2004 presidential election, paid for all that mudslinging. So that's where it all came from, and Rick Perry's still tooting the horn on it. And the good news is there are West Texans, there are New Mexicans, there are folks across the country who fought all of these bad ideas, are fighting the expansion of the low-level dump, are fighting this newly proposed high-level radioactive waste dump, and we're doing everything we can to stop it. But a lot more Texans, a lot more New Mexicans, and folks along the transportation route all over the country have got to jump into this fight because we're like the little Dutch boy with our finger in the dike.
I know that you've done a lot of writing on the nuclear regulatory committee and the kind of either conflicts of interest there or just generally the lack of real any sort of accountability when we're talking about nuclear regulations. And yet this kind of broad coalition has really continued to put pressure on so many different fronts in order to bring about kind of public awareness on this. I'm wondering if you can kind of tell us a little bit about your struggles first, and then why, you know, this between this dump site in West Texas and the other one being proposed in New Mexico, you're saying that this is would be the essentially largest project of nuclear waste storage in history, and sort of the implications that would have, even larger than this Yucca Mountain dump site. Yeah, I'm wondering if you can give us a little bit of a kind of the history and the backstory of how those have unfolded.
Yeah, so, you know, we've got at this point 80,000 metric tons of just commercial high-level radioactive waste from atomic reactors, mostly in the east. If you drew a center line down the middle of the country, 90% of the reactors and 90% of the radioactive waste is east of the center line, 75% east of the Mississippi River. And so back in 1987, Nevada was informed by the rest of the country that you're going to be our nuclear waste dump. The legislation on Capitol Hill was called the Screw Nevada Bill, and it disregarded geological truths that the site was scientifically unsuitable that were known at the time. And more geologic and hydrologic and even seismological and even earthquake and volcanic fatal flaws of the Yucca site have come to light since. So the state of Nevada, 1,000 environmental groups, the Western Shoshone Indian Nation have all fought tooth and nail for 30 plus years, ever since the Screw Nevada Bill of 1987, to stop the Yucca dump. That fight still goes on, but now the nuclear power lobbyists, because they can't easily open Yucca, in fact, they're never going to get that site, have turned to this plan B, which is interim storage, consolidate all the waste in a place like West Texas. And then, in fact, that New Mexico site, it's called Holtec International Eddie Lee Energy Alliance after the counties down in southeastern New Mexico, just 40 miles from WCS in West Texas. That's plan B. And if you add it up, 40,000 metric tons at West Texas, 170,000 metric tons in New Mexico, over 200,000 metric tons. It's 3 times the size of the Yucca proposal. And that includes the waste shipments that would impact most states in the lower 48, 100 major cities, the vast majority of U.S. congressional districts. So what folks listening can do is just contact all of your elected officials, including in Texas right now, the state legislators, your state House member, your state senator, because as we speak, they're considering a major expansion of the low-level dump at Waste Control Specialists. So tell them to stop that, and also to stop the high-level dump that's targeting Texas.
That's real important, absolutely, for people to continue kind of contacting senators about this and say that, we don't want any of this anywhere. When we're talking about sort of this transportation, this storage, why have kind of New Mexico and West Texas been targeted so much for these nuclear storage proposals, these just kind of massive radioactive dump sites?
Yeah, I think the answer is because they've gotten away with it in the past. So in New Mexico, for example, Los Alamos was opened in 1942, and ever since they've just expanded the nuclear footprint on New Mexico, uranium mining, uranium enrichment, radioactive waste dumping of various sorts, but nothing like this. And then in West Texas, same story, because they got away with the Waste Control Specialists low-level waste dump, they've decided, well, if we got away with that, maybe we can get away with a high-level too. So that's how they see it, as the path of least resistance. And the only way we stop these bad proposals is to increase the resistance. And we've won many of these battles. In fact, we won one of these battles right there in southeast New Mexico 20 plus years ago when the Mescalero Apache Indian Reservation was targeted for one of these interim storage sites. And the traditionals on the reservation, like Rufina Marie Laws and Joe Geronimo, who's a descendant of his famous ancestor, led the effort, paid a high price. Rufina Marie Laws got death threats. She had to go into hiding. But our side won that fight. And so here we go again. We're trying to stop it again.
Another interesting thing is just how often kind of indigenous peoples have been the targets of this sort of thing, the environmental racism that really goes along with so many of these proposals. We've talked about the kind of environmental racism that's targeted people in, for instance, Houston have experienced that a lot with regard to where they build different chemical plants there. And we've seen that come to sort of national exposure again based on the kind of the chemical fires that just took place in Deer Park. And I think there were a couple other ones right after that. So much of that was in these kind of these Black and Latinx and in indigenous neighborhoods. We saw the kind of environmental racism perpetrated against these indigenous tribes throughout the Southwest. And so from my understanding, so many indigenous peoples have suffered much higher rates of cancer, really, really disproportionate rates of cancer because of just the radioactivity surrounding this sort of thing, and even going back to the testing, the atomic testing during the 1940s. It seems to be as much of a racism issue as it is obviously an environmental issue, to the degree that those things can be separated, from my understanding.
Yeah, you've got it. I mean, the Western Shoshone Indian Nation, whose land is Nevada, they call it Nuwa Segovia. they are the most bombed nation on Earth when it comes to the Nevada test site, nuclear weapons testing. It opened in 1951. They did atmospheric tests there until the early 60s. Then they kept doing it underground. A lot of those leaked into the environment. Yes, the radioactive impact just from nuclear weapons testing on indigenous peoples. In New Mexico, the impacts of uranium mining on indigenous peoples like the Pueblo and the Dene. And like we mentioned with Mescalero Apache, they were targeted for this high-level waste dump. In a sense, they're being targeted again because Holtec International is very close to the reservation, relatively speaking. It's just not on it this time. It's on their traditional land, which happen to be, at this point in time, largely Hispanic communities. So again, it is radioactive racism. It's environmental injustice. In fact, one of the groups I mentioned, there's great people fighting these bad ideas. One of the groups is Alliance for Environmental Strategies, based in southeastern New Mexico. So they've intervened in the Nuclear Regulatory Commission licensing proceeding. They've been joined by a coalition of environmental groups from all over the country along these transport routes. National groups like ours, Beyond Nuclear and Sierra Club, the oldest and biggest environmental group in the country. The state chapters in Texas and New Mexico are fighting these proposals. And just to bring it full circle, the environmental injustice of the transport of the radioactive waste, a lot of the high-level waste is going to go by rail. And guess who lives along the rail lines? Low-income people of color. And whatever other modes, whether it's truck shipments down the highways or barge shipments on the waterways, many times it's low-income people of color who live along those transportation routes.
When we're talking about the transportation routes, the fact that so much of this nuclear waste is being transported across the country, of course, affects everybody. So much of this would have to, at some point, I feel like, go through kind of major cities, at which point that, puts it becomes as much of a national security issue as anything. It's amazing to me that we're still kind of having this, and that given the kind of dangers and given the clear the potential for environmental destruction of nuclear energy, that this continues to be such a massive problem to which some people say that there's no way to solve, that somehow that we just have to have this, which is clearly not the case. There are so many safer forms of energy, and I think to some degree, people have forgotten just how dangerous nuclear energy can be. Possibly, I can think of a few reasons why that might be, as far as the history of environmental movements and whatnot. So if you're just tuning in, you are listening to People's Republic with Brian Griffith. We're joined by Kevin Kamps, who's a radioactive waste watchdog at Beyond Nuclear. We're talking about the proposed attempt to set up a radioactive dump site, or expand a radioactive dump site that would bring in 40,000 metric tons of radioactive nuclear waste to West Texas. This is going to be in Andrews County. The local media has reported on this as a kind of minor scuffle between the oil and gas industry and the company Nuclear Waste Control Specialists, when in reality there's a far greater problem at risk here, other than just access to another kind of, in many ways, almost as destructive form of energy, fossil fuels. I don't foresee within that particular battle between oil and gas and the nuclear storage, there's no real kind of winner there. Either way, if somebody wins out there, Texas loses and the environment loses and the planet loses. I guess I'm wondering what sort of the ideal fixes to these are. Like what if we could move forward with kind of solving the problems of nuclear waste that we have now, what would that kind of ideally look like, and what have been some of the kind of obvious barriers in this kind of horrific system that we have toward achieving that? Like how would we have sort of a safe storage of existing nuclear waste, and sort of an end to the production of this sort of waste, while having a kind of green energy and whatnot?
Yeah, well, you've got it. I mean, dirty, dangerous, and expensive energies like nuclear and like fossil fuels are of the past, and renewables and efficiency are the future, if we're going to have a future. So one of the best solutions to radioactive waste, the only one actually, is to not make it in the first place. And what that means at this point is shut down the atomic reactors and replace them with energy efficiency and renewables like wind power and solar power. But like we mentioned, there's more than 80,000 metric tons of just commercial waste in the United States, and that grows by 2,000 metric tons per year. So we need to shut the reactors down, stop making more. But for the stuff that exists already, what the environmental movement of the country agrees on, for the most part, is called hardened on-site storage, or if that's not appropriate, then hardened near-site storage. And it's explicitly opposed to this consolidated interim storage like proposed, targeted at West Texas. It's explicitly opposed to the Yucca Mountain dump in Nevada. And what it means is get it out of the storage pools that it's in, where it's very vulnerable to a catastrophic accident or even a terrorist attack, and put it into hardened dry cast storage that's built well, designed well in the first place, and takes into consideration things like intentional attacks, accidents, requires monitoring for temperature, pressure, radioactivity. If you can believe it or not, everything I've just mentioned is not required on the storage on-site of high-level radioactive waste in this country. So we're really living on borrowed time. And the best example of this is Fukushima Daiichi. Everything that happened to Fukushima Daiichi that we know of anyway was reactor releases from meltdowns and damaged or destroyed containments. What almost happened at Fukushima Daiichi was a pool fire with high-level radioactive waste in storage. And if that had happened, instead of 160,000 nuclear evacuees from that region, it could have been as many as 50 million nuclear evacuees. And we're living with even worse pool risks in this country. So hardened on-site storage has to happen regardless of anything else. Even if somewhere to ship it to open today, which isn't happening, it would be a very long wait, especially for operating reactors. And you still have operating reactors at the South Texas project, at the Peak. They're at the back of the line for exporting their waste anywhere else. And, instead of Texas, exporting its waste, this proposal for West Texas is inviting the rest of the country's waste in. And once it's there, listen not to me, listen to Rick Perry. He said once it's there, it's very likely to stay forever, only at the surface, not even in an underground repository. So just maximized risks. It's radioactive greed that's driving this whole thing. And that's a bad way to make decisions.
Yeah, it really is. And just the realization that all of this is going to be just sitting on the surface in what's, what one of the organizations in your coalition has described as a kind of de facto permanent surface storage, quote unquote, parking lot dump. That was coming from Michael Keegan of Don't Waste Michigan. That does not account for any of the possibilities from as we talked about, like a worst case scenario, a terrorist attack, but then all of the other possible things that could happen, fire, weather, whatnot, that would cause all of this to possibly either leach into the soil or find its way to become airborne in a state as already deregulated as Texas, in a country with a nuclear regulatory committee as deregulated as the United States, provides the potential for something that is truly catastrophic. And you don't get that sense, I've said this a couple times already, but you don't get that sense of this being a potential either national or planet-wide catastrophe from what you read about this. Anyone who's looked at, for instance, Houston, anyone who's familiar with kind of the lack of regulations, both around kind of real estate and construction, as well as a lack of regulations about, sort of chemical storage and factories and whatnot. And even when there is regulation around these, major chemical factories there and these chemical storage places, it's often cheaper just to pay off the fines than it is to actually make your storage safer and more efficient. So that led to that major fire that happened, where you essentially saw the huge toxic plume of smoke over the city of Houston, the fourth largest city in the U.S. Could something similar happen with a nuclear with a kind of nuclear dumping site in West Texas, where you would have not only a plume of smoke, but kind of a radioactive plume of smoke? I mean, is that a kind of realistic scenario given the lack of regulations around these dumping sites? I just wonder kind of what one of these looks like.
Yeah, absolutely. Even though the high-level radioactive waste at this point is in solid form, the metal involved in the fuel rods called zirconium, has an ignition temperature of around 1,800 or 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. So once you hit that temperature, you can spark a fire, and then it's an exothermic reaction. It just feeds itself like a wildfire. And depending on how much of the waste that fire can reach, you could have a mega catastrophe in terms of radioactivity in the smoke blowing downwind. And that's kind of what happened at Fukushima Daiichi. Those were meltdowns instead of fires, but kind of the same dynamic. Volatile radioactive poisons like cesium-137, which lodges in human muscle tissue, will escape in the fire and travel with the smoke and blow long distances downwind. That's just one of a couple hundred radioactive poisons that are in high-level radioactive waste. And a fire is very possible. The Holtec plan is to put the waste down in pits, and they try to sell it as a security feature. But a flaw is there are no drains in those pits. And so one scenario could be a crashing jetliner with jet fuel on fire going down into those pits and just having to burn itself out. That would be the only contingency. And if the containers were to breach, if the zirconium were to, not even if the zirconium ignites, but there's going to be cesium that gets out even if the zirconium doesn't ignite. So yes, the fire scenario is a serious one. Another one is just corrosion over time, releasing the contents, and the West Texas site is above the Oglala, or else very near. And as the Oglala expands and contracts, it could be under the site. And leakage will go down to the Oglala, which is vital to 8 states on the high plains in terms of drinking water, irrigation water.
I try not to sort of imagine doomsday scenarios, but I think part of part of what's important with this sort of thing is to show people what all of the what the real possibilities here are. This is something that really only has to happen once. This is not and again, we have had nuclear very near misses where, as you said, would have affected up to 50 million people having to evacuate if Fukushima and Daiichi had gone just slightly different. This is something that's happening kind of right within our backyard. This is something that where the kind of regulations have already shown themselves to be in so many ways not enough or absolutely bare bones. I mean, even the fact that everything that's not actually nuclear waste, just to sort of recap here, everything that is not officially sort of the spent nuclear fuel, anything else within the category of nuclear waste is considered to be kind of low level, even though, as you said, many of these are deadly to kind of stand in front of for as little as 20 minutes. I hope I'm not kind of misrepresenting that. And this is happening right here.
No, that's accurate. Yeah.
Yeah.
The high-level waste can deliver a fatal dose of gamma radiation, but also neutron radiation in as little as minutes, depending on how long it's been out of the reactor core. I mean, if it's just out, it can kill you within seconds if you don't have radiation shielding. That's the near distance risk. But then if you look at the long duration of time risk, it's the risk of this stuff getting out. And like I said, it could be something as simple as rust. There's a Crosby, Stills and Nash song about Yucca Mountain. I think it's called Don't Dig Here. And one of the lines is rust never sleeps. And because this waste is deadly forever, its containers are going to fail at some point. And if it's at the surface and they're not replaced, and that stuff just leaks out at the surface into the environment, it's going to be catastrophic downstream, downwind. It's deadly forever.
So in our last minute or two, is there anything else you'd kind of like to touch on that you feel that we didn't cover here? Because I feel like this is, because it's a little, the topic of nuclear waste is a little out of my depth. Sometimes I don't necessarily know kind of the right questions to ask. If there's anything you feel that really needs to kind of be said, now's kind of the time if you want to go ahead and put that forward.
Yeah. For listeners, everybody can make a difference. We need all the help that we can get across the country, and especially in Texas. So contact groups like the Seed Coalition in Austin. Contact Public Citizen's Office in Texas. They're some of the leaders in this fight. And, contact your state legislators. Contact your governor, your state AG, your U.S. congressional members. Get on their radar screen. And if they don't listen to you, show up at their office. We've really got to take it up some notches. And, the Sunrise Movement, this youth-led climate movement, is showing how it's done. They're taking over congressional offices on the Hill. and can't be ignored. And we have to fight the good fight, because the fight is on. There's no avoiding it at this point.
Yeah, absolutely. Now's the time to really bring these kind of environmental issues and the subject of environmental safety into as sharp focus as possible, and to really put the pressure on. So we're going to go ahead and wrap up this segment. We have been joined by Kevin Kamps, who's a radioactive waste watchdog at Beyond Nuclear, to talk about the proposed radioactive waste dump in West Texas. It will bring 40,000 metric tons of radioactive waste just essentially sitting on the surface on West Texas there. Thank you very much, Kevin, for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
We are joined again by Juliet Barbara, Communications Director with the Workers' Defense Project, for updates on several stories regarding essentially Texas labor and the Texas workforce. There's a lot of very key things here, a lot of very key stories that have continued to develop. So I'm very, very happy to get kind of back into these because it really does have consequences, not just for the entire state of Texas, but a lot of the precedent that's being set here is also being fought out in other states as well, with regard to the Texas Workforce Commission and what appears to be a conflict of interest between the Texas Workforce Commission and these essentially the quote unquote gig economy companies. So to talk about all this and more is once again Juliet Barbara, the Communications Director with the Workers' Defense Project. Thank you, Juliet, for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
So let's, we have, I think, 4 stories here, actually. Let's start with the first one. We discussed this at length last time. Since then, we've had a major kind of update. That is, the Workforce Commission vote will, this is from the press release, Workforce Commission vote will rob Texas workers of key benefits now and in the future. So if we can recap real fast what this Workforce Commission decision was all about and what sort of impact you kind of expect that to have.
Sure. So this proposed rule that was recently passed by the Texas Workforce Commission relates to how workers who find work on digital platforms are classified. Essentially, the proposed rule that was first made public in December 2018, the Friday before Christmas in the dark of the night, would make it so that anyone who finds work on a digital platform or is distributed or is dispatched via a digital platform like Handy or Uber would be classified as a marketplace contractor. This is a new term that lobbyists have created to reclassify workers. And according to this rule, employers would not have to provide unemployment insurance. Now, this is problematic not only because people need unemployment insurance, they need that security when they lose a job, but also because it creates this precedent that could lead to millions of workers across Texas being misclassified as independent contractors, meaning they would not be eligible for all of the benefits that people who operate as employees are due, including paid time off, healthcare, of course, unemployment insurance, workers' compensation, and the like.
I think this is a real important story to follow because in many ways, the precedents being set here are a race to the bottom, not just for the people not just for the people who will be affected by this, who have been in the so-called gig economy, as many problems as there are with that term. The people who are contracted through, companies such as Uber, Lyft. The one that's mentioned here is Handy. But there are so many of these others where, in a sense, if you look at the business model of these, it's not a sustainable business model for the workers or even for the company. It's not clear that a company like Uber can necessarily even, kind of make bank, that it's even necessarily financially solvent in the long term. But it's been in, these companies, many of these have been invested in specifically because of their kind of disruptive effects for the rest of the workforce. They drive wages down, not just for their own employees, but for the entire, whatever the field happens to be in. So you see the effects that Uber has had, for instance, on the taxi industries, where now, because taxi industries are having to compete with this deunionized, deregulated industry, the wages are just kind of deteriorating and the working conditions are deteriorating for everybody. I wonder what sort of effects you've kind of seen that this kind of downward push has on people's livelihoods, on people's wages, and on people's workers protection and other sort of things, just general like ways of life.
Right. Well, we know that it puts pressure on businesses who can't compete with multinational tech companies that come in and lobby for these kinds of roles. And in this case, that was exactly who lobbied for this role. It was an out-of-state company called Handy, digital platform that provides carpentry services and the like. And so we know of some businesses that have said, look, this makes it really hard for me to compete because it is much more cost effective to treat your employees as independent contractors. But then what if you're trying to be a good employer, a good small business, like one of our friends, Purple Fig, which is an eco cleaning company in Austin? They said that this creates an unlevel playing field for me because I want to provide my workers compensation and I want to provide them health insurance, but there's no way that I can keep up if other companies are coming in with a different business model. And of course, then if the future of work continues to shift in this direction, which it will, employees will be guaranteed less and less of these benefits. It makes it harder to create a career, right? These are gigs, they're not careers. But we need to evolve the future of work in a way that includes their voices, and that's not happening right now.
Yeah, and I think another important part for that is it takes less money out of the entire economy in general. When you have this downward pressure on wages, when all of a sudden all of these companies have to compete by lowering their own wages or whatever the case is, because small businesses just have a harder time competing. Just in a market with this sort of thing where it's the complete lack of regulation. So then it creates this downward spiral in wages. Well, we're kind of at this point already. We're nearing this point where our wages can't really go much lower. Most people are already struggling. Rent has gone through the roof. The cost of living has risen so much. Wages have been stagnant for decades. The minimum wage is the same now as it was something like 30 years ago, to a matter of cents there. And so with all of this, there's less money circulating in the economy. So therefore, with less money circulating in the economy, there's less kind of room for people to purchase stuff. That's just kind of the way that works. And so that then affects it's an entire economic effects. Like I kind of said, it's this downward spiral. It's this just downward pressure that really hurts everybody except for, I guess you would call it whatever you want to call it, the 1% or the billionaire class. People have kind of different terms. I'm wondering if if you have any sort of like more kind of thoughts on this story just generally, or the other part of this is where did kind of this rule decision come about?
Yeah.
Well,
and I think what you're saying is exactly related to how it came about. And that is corporate influences basically writing legislation, handing it over to a state agency, and then they pass it. That's exactly what happened here. So when the rule was first proposed in December, we and other groups said, who was behind this? Because it's not benefiting Texas workers. And so there has to be someone who's winning. And we knew that around the state and around the country, lobbyists for Handy and Uber had been writing this legislation and actually passing it through legislatures. What was different about this situation is that it looked like that was happening at a state agency staffed by people who are appointed by the governor, not elected by the people. And so we filed an open records request, and then back in March, we got the response to that open records request and had hundreds of pages of emails that had taken place over a year between Commissioner Hughes of the Texas Workforce Commission and lobbyists representing Handy. I mean, it was completely obvious that Handy lobbyists had written this rule soup to nuts. There was even a document that they shared with the commissioner called Handy Proposal, which is like 80% identical to the rule that was proposed. And not only did they hand this over on a silver platter to the TWC, but no workers' rights voices were included. And so that is why we see this downward pressure on wages, as you're saying, Brian, and because workers are not part of the calculation. And we saw that very clearly when the only commissioner of the three commissioners who opposed this was the person representing labor.
Yeah, and when we're talking about just the fact that like these companies are just writing these proposals and lobbying to get them kind of as is, I'm looking for the exact amount. Here we go. Yeah, of the proposed rule by the Texas Workforce Commission, the one that's now been passed, there are 9 conditions that must be met by these these app-based companies for the workers to be considered independent contractors. Seven of those criteria out of the 9 are nearly identical to the language proposed on behalf of Handy. So that right there should just be worrisome to everybody when we realize that these private companies are writing, essentially able to just go in, bypass all kind of elected officials, because the Texas Workforce Commission, I don't believe any of them were elected, correct? Just to recap.
Exactly.
Bypassing all elected officials and just being able to go directly to the Texas Workforce Commission and just slap this down and say, here's what we want the new labor laws to be. Should just that's disturbing to me, just on so many levels.
Exactly, which is exactly why we and our partners, including the Texas AFL-CIO, decided to blow this up and make a big deal about it. Because if we don't, this will go by, without any discussion, without any protest. And I'm sure that things like this do all the time. And what was even more concerning in this case is that these documents revealed how shady this coordination with lobbyists really was. There were 2 lobbyists named in the documents. Neither of them were registered to lobby for Handy over this time. And in fact, one of the lobbyists, Jerry Valdez, after this went public, paid a fine almost, in advance of getting in trouble because he knew that he hadn't registered. And so, did the TWC know that these individuals weren't registered? The TWC even went on the record after this became public, before we made the documents public, saying that they don't use outside sources when they write rules. So there seems to be a cover-up, and that's even more concerning. There's such hubris around the creation of these rules, like no one is going to notice, but we're noticing.
If I had to guess, having followed these things before, the fine is probably far less than what the lobbyist is making by a long shot.
Yes, absolutely. I think he paid a total of $1,500. So this was a drop in the bucket for him.
Oh, wow. I'm sure he's devastated. I'm sure what kind of lobbyist can afford a $1,500 fine, right? So that with regard to the Texas Workforce Commission, how this played out, the 2-to-1 decision to reclassify these people as a marketplace contractors, a kind of the newest term to avoid, to skirt what should be regulations. It puts downward pressure on wages. It takes money out of the retirement as well, or
essentially it robs the unemployment insurance fund.
Unemployment.
Millions of dollars. Which is another reason why when we heard about this, we asked, why? Texas Workforce Commission, shouldn't this be a concern for you? And we still wonder why. We wonder who else was behind this.
Yeah. And of course, this is also affecting so many other states. We're seeing similar regulation across the country. The other states, the lobbyists, these same lobbyists from the company Handy, have been pushing legislation across the country, including Arizona, Florida, Indiana, Iowa, Kentucky, Tennessee, and Utah, which have approved these quote unquote marketplace contractor laws. And then 4 states, Alabama, California, Colorado, and Georgia have rejected such proposals. So this is something that's going on nationwide. This is a lobbying effort that, again, has consequences for people all across the country. And if it's able to successfully go unchallenged here in Texas, where we record, it only kind of lays the groundwork for continued deregulation and this downward pressure of wages. And when we're talking about downward pressure of wages, we're talking about downward pressure of all other quality of life things across the country. I just want to also kind of briefly mention that having done so much kind of independent contractor work, having been, to my understanding, illegally classified myself as an independent contractor for various employers in Texas, I've calculated before that I've probably lost as much as $20,000. I don't say lost is not the right word. That's $20,000 that's been stolen from me. That is wage theft. When you illegally classify someone as an independent contractor in order to pay less money to them or to the state, that is wage theft. So by my own count, I've lost as much as possibly more than $20,000 over the past maybe 5 years or so due to this kind of wage theft. It's such a pervasive thing here in Texas. It's such a pervasive thing nationwide, and it just, it worries me. It really does in so many ways.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a huge issue. And for us, we represent, mostly low-wage construction workers, most of whom are foreign-born. And these are individuals who are especially vulnerable and are taken advantage of all the time by contractors. They can work for weeks and not be paid at all. And that's on top of the issue of being misclassified as an independent contractor, which, as you're saying, is absolutely wage theft.
Yeah, so that's an important story. We're going to continue to follow this and continue to report on it. If you're just tuning in, you are listening to People's Republic with Brian Griffith. People's Republic originates on KOOP Austin and is also broadcast on WHIV in New Orleans. We are also available as a podcast wherever podcasts are podded. We are speaking with Juliet Barbara of the Workers' Defense Project. We just kind of covered the story about the key benefits that are essentially being robbed from Texas workers through this Texas Workforce Commission. But there's also a lot of other kind of state interference going on here, especially around the issue of paid sick time. I know the Workers' Defense Project has really been spearheading a lot of the efforts around paid sick leave. I believe since this is mid or late 2017 that I've kind of been following it. So I'm wondering if you can kind of, briefly kind of bring people up to speed with, what this paid sick leave campaign has been all about, where it's kind of been most active. Of course, here in Austin, the city actually passed a paid sick leave campaign, or passed a paid sick leave ordinance rather, and yet we have not seen yet any of the benefits of that. Maybe you can kind of bring us up to speed as to where that is and why this has been such a kind of continued struggle.
Yeah. So, and paid sick time is one of those essential protections that every single person should be guaranteed. You get sick, you are the head of the household, you have kids, but you can't stay home from work. And so you have to choose. Do you want to stay home from work or do you want to go to work sick? And if you stay home from work, you get a pay cut or you could lose your job, right? And then your entire livelihood can fall apart. We also see it with people who have to stay home or who have a sick child. They become less likely to stay home with a sick child if they don't have paid sick time. And then it becomes a public health issue because you got to send your kid sick to school, or you have to go to work with the flu. This is such a basic protection and everyone should have it. But unfortunately, 40% of people in Texas, 40% of workers don't have it. These folks are disproportionately low income. They're disproportionately people of color. And they're also often in the service industry. So they're serving our food, which is another reason why it's a public health issue. In the case of what's happening right now in Texas, this is a classic push and pull between cities and the state. As you mentioned, Brian, Austin did win a paid sick time ordinance. It was what the people of Austin wanted. And we've had similar ordinances around the state, including having to do with rest breaks. Now the state is coming in and trying to prevent or preempt this legislation from taking place. This is done through some really extreme legislation that's been proposed in the Texas Senate. The first bill was called SB 15. It has now been broken up into individual bills in an effort to kind of sneak through individual bills and make this less kind of detected. But SB 15 would essentially do away with any local protections for any kind of employment benefit, including paid sick time, but also ordinances like rest breaks, water breaks, things that people deserve. And so we are fighting at the legislature with our partners in the Working Texans for Paid Sick Leave Coalition to stop this from moving forward. And also we're going to be working in the House to fight this as well.
Yeah, and this is it almost seems like paid sick time for especially the workers we're talking about, so many of whom are service industry. It don't to use a term I'm not too fond of, but it almost seems like it'd be a common sense proposal to that regard, that you would not, that there would be a public health component to that. You would not want people having to work sick, and yet here we are.
Absolutely. I would, it's not far from the anti-vaxxer argument. Like, this is a public health issue. We need to make sure that people are coming to work not sick, not contaminated, but almost more importantly, this is a family issue. If you can't take time off when you're sick, your family struggles. And we have stories of so many people, so many workers who, for example, had to go to work with a knee injury and then hurt themselves even more and then had to quit their job or got fired because they had to go to work injured.
Yeah, a real important thing to cover, and it's always sort of interesting to see how that it plays out between kind of the state legislature and more kind of usually progressive local city ordinances. Of course, when I talk about kind of progressive city ordinances, that's not necessarily because all the politicians are just amazing and they get elected because they're just they care so much about the people. I'm sure some do. I'm sure there are some genuinely progressive politicians, but I always like to kind of point out where the balance of power is when we're talking about these progressive kind of ordinances. These things start, and the just general progressive pushes to make things better for the most people start with kind of these grassroots movements. They start absolutely from that kind of infrastructure of grassroots independent organizations in the city that say to themselves, something has to be done, and we have to be the people to do it, and we have to kind of build this kind of mass movement around it. So those kind of things happen so much in cities that kind of force these more progressive proposals, and then of course we see the state legislature. The incredibly kind of gerrymandered state legislature and whatnot, just able to shoot these things down. I wonder, what then is the tactic with something like that? When you have something like this where the state is kind of trying to preemptively head off all of these really powerful local pushes, when the state is trying to essentially like strike down even the possibility for these local pushes to go forward, what then becomes the tactic in order to use to try and make sure that we're able to get these sort of benefits?
Well, and that's exactly right. And I think one thing I would add about the legislature is that they are in the pockets of corporations. There's a reason that they are attacking paid sick time, and it's because corporations are telling them what to do. In terms of how we respond to this, some of it is just to roll up your sleeves and do the block and tackle every single day at the legislature. Bills are being proposed all the time. We at Workers' Defense have an incredible lobbyist who basically lives in the Capitol. She walks into representative and senators' offices nonstop. And we work in our coalitions, and that's what gives us strength. We work with the Texas AFL-CIO. We work with the Texas Organizing Project. And together we are able to wage campaigns in response to legislation. So that looks like holding hearings at the Capitol about the benefits of paid sick time, publishing research to show how popular paid sick time is, how common sense it is, and how important it is. We have testimony at every single hearing you can imagine. And we, of course, hold protests and rallies, and we work with people who do support paid sick time, including the Austin City Council.
Yeah. And, on the kind of issue of all that and where that information can be found, especially some of the kind of more in-depth research that I've seen, all of that can be found at workersdefense.org. That continues to remain kind of a really important resource for so many of us who are following this sort of thing. So it looks like we have time for two more stories that I think are absolutely worth a mention and worth a discussion. The first is the major ICE raids. I believe that's the largest in decades of immigration raids. Obviously, ICE came out of the Bush administration, but this is some of the largest immigration raids in decades. Happened in Allen, Texas, after which they received, the ICE received so much kind of praise and support from Mike Pence and from other just kind of these highly reactionary figures. Workers' Defense Project, of course, along with so many other organizations, issued a response to this, a condemnation of Pence's praise for ICE, but also then kind of, by proxy in a lot of ways, a condemnation of the actual the arrest of 280 plus workers in Allen, Texas. I'm wondering, if you can kind of go down, what this story was all about. Why this attack on like 280 workers in a community why ICE would consider that to be a necessity, and then sort of what Workers' Defense Project response has been. Yeah,
this was, as you said, Brian, this was the biggest workplace raid in more than a decade. in the U.S., so it's happening right here in our backyard in Texas. And in terms of why ICE would do this, well, they have the mandate from President Trump. They have the mandate from Mike Pence, who was just in Houston and applauded them. And so it is fueled by this racist, anti-immigrant agenda, which gives ICE unfettered powers, right, to go and wage attacks on immigrants in Texas and in our country. In this case, it was a cell phone repair company, a tech company. They pulled out 280 individuals who are undocumented and put them right back into this pipeline to deportation that we see all across the country. And this matters a lot to us at Workers Defense and to our allies because, one, we're talking about the individuals who are essential to our workforce, right? These are people, these are families who are fueling the Texas economy. In our case, in the case of construction, roughly half of the individuals in the construction industry in Texas, which is huge, are undocumented. So they should be treated with respect. They should be treated recognizing the value that they provide to our economy and our culture. And we know from hearing our members speak to us about this, that this creates chilling effects. This is not the kind of way that we repay hardworking people for fueling our economy.
The other kind of thing I want to mention in our last few minutes is around the so-called Freedom Cities policy that was passed I think it was last year here in Austin.
Yep.
And so we're just now seeing the results of some of that, which was to create a greater transparency around essentially police and ICE collaborations in Austin. There was some pretty chilling information around Austin Police Department's collaboration with ICE. If you can maybe talk a little bit more about that story.
Yeah. So as part of the Freedom City policy, which we helped pass last year, which was a response to SB 4, we were able to win increased transparency between the Austin Police Department and the public. And so this was the first report that APD was required to file as part of that policy. And this report detailed any coordination or information sharing between APD and ICE over, I think, a period of a year. What we found is more than 600 instances when APD shared information with ICE. And some of it was really bizarre, like utility bills, cell phone bills. This seems so superfluous. And so this was like a really big revelation to us. And we, and also Greg Kassar of the Austin City Council, responded and asked, why are we giving so much information to ICE? And we're in conversation with the Austin Police Department about it.
It's always important for me to highlight the sort of the disparity between what people assume police in a progressive city are versus what the police actually are. So obviously we've covered quite a bit the APD scandals around the first untested rape kits, but then later the kind of what seems to be a false clearance rate that was related that actually made national news, where they were kind of falsely clearing a lot of well over 1,000 rape cases as having been quote unquote exceptionally cleared, when in fact no one had been, no arrests had been made, no charges had been pressed with regard to kind of the rape clearance scandal. And so, APD, Austin Police Department, kind of once again finding themselves in hot water and having to explain their actions here. So yeah, we're going to continue to cover all those stories, but for now we are out of time. We have been joined by Juliet Barbara of the Workers Defense Project. You can find them at workersdefense.org. Thank you, Julia, for coming back on the show.
My pleasure.
That's all we have for this week. You have been listening to People's Republic with Brian Griffith. People's Republic is produced at KOOP Community Radio in Austin, Texas, and is also syndicated on WHIV 102.3 FM in New Orleans. You can find our show on SoundCloud, iTunes, Spreaker, Spotify, and Stitcher by typing in People's Republic, or you can visit us on Facebook and Twitter at People's Radio ATX. Thanks for listening as we report on the global struggle for social and economic justice. We are out of here.